Welcome back to Filling in the History. I am the amateur historian. This is episode 47, and we are going to be talking today about sections 133 and 134, which is back in time. So these sections are actually given in the 1830s, which means basically we are going to part ways with this idea that these sections somehow have to do with the history of the church. We are done with that. And now what we're going to do is the first part of this episode is just going to be the revelations that I've described. And the second part of it, we're just going to go right into our document series, and we're going to try to pluck out things that are of interest. Obviously, there's a lot of land sales and, deeds and stuff like that I don't think it's really interesting to listen to. So, but we'll be going through this. Now, what's interesting about the document series at this point, if you don't know, is that if you were to look at this, you'll notice that it's like March through July of 1843. So there's parts in these books, and each part now is 1 month. We have enough documents to fill up that time. So we're going to fill in some of that, but before that, we're going to go back in time, and we're going to talk about sections 133 and 134 of the Doctrine and Covenants. So here we go. The earliest version of section 133 is actually found in Revelation Book 1. Remember that? Handwriting of John Whitmer. It is given in 1831, so we're way back. We are over 10 years in the past now. We got a few corrections, especially on page 119, where the words Elijah, Abraham, and Moses are sort of moved around somewhat in that context. We also get a copy in what's called the Appendix to Revelation Book 1, and this is also in the handwriting of John Whitmer, and it was kind of just attached in later on to the back of Revelation Book 1 at some later time. We also get a copy in the Evening and Morning Star. The 1835 Doctrine and Covenants has a copy, and it notes it as Section C, or in this case, it's actually meaning 100. So it's Roman numerals here. This is not a section, and it is called Appendix. So it is published in another Evening and Morning Star edition. And we also get a copy in the Manuscript History of the Church, and Willard Richards is writing that one. And so, again, that'll be sort of back in time in a previous volume of the History of the Church, as we call it today. It does appear in the 1844 Doctrine and Covenants as Section 108, but it is still called an appendix. And even in our current introductions, it calls it an appendix. So let's talk about the introduction to this, the circumstances surrounding this. So the earliest copy simply gives 72, a revelation received November 3rd, 1831. We get no introduction into the extra copy in the back of Revelation Book 1. It's just kind of there. There is a 4-paragraph explanation in the Evening and Morning Star about the attack on the Book of Commandments printing operation and an apology that the members won't be getting the Book of Commandments as planned. So the appendix wasn't able to be printed, and so they printed it in the newspaper instead because that's the best they could do, and they apologized about all that. The second Evening and Morning Star copy does have the same explanation, starting with a finger pointing in the way, little finger there, and it ends with this. It says, "The book from which this important revelation is taken will be published in the course of the present year at from 25 to 50 cents a copy. We regret that in consequence of circumstances not within our control, this book will not be offered to our brethren as soon as was anticipated. We beg their forbearance and solicit an interest in their prayers, promising to use our exertions with all our means to accomplish the work." Okay. So, yeah, that's the apology that I've told you about before. All right. With Doctrine and Covenants copies, we've already kind of covered those. They just say appendix. There are some changes to the section headings. The only thing that we get really is a distinction between something the prophet says as opposed to just saying this is coming from the Joseph Smith history. So maybe we're just citationing things a little better, but that's the difference in modern section headings. Historical introduction gives us this. According to a later history, Joseph Smith dictated this revelation on the 3rd of November, 1831, in answer to elders' questions about the gathering and preaching the gospel to the inhabitants of the earth. The history indicates that this revelation was dictated following the 2-day conference in Hiram, Ohio, which focused on the publication of Joseph Smith's revelations in the Book of Commandments. This revelation, which was later designated as the appendix to the Book of Commandments, followed the 1st of November dictation of the preface to that book. And this is sort of pairing up with the preface's revelation, which we now call section 1. And it says, the preface placed Joseph Smith's revelation in a millenarian context, and this 3rd of November revelation continued in that millenarian theme, meaning like a millennium. Beginning with a call for the saints to prepare for the second coming of Jesus Christ by leaving Babylon and gathering to Zion, the revelation then extended this message to all people. It warned of Christ's imminent return to the earth in power and glory, and of the events that would precede and accompany that return. It also provided an explicit statement that God wanted Joseph Smith's revelations to go to the world to prepare the inhabitants of the earth for Christ's return. Now, again, this was never published in the Book of Commandments, probably because it was supposed to be last, as they were kind of doing the gatherings of pages and printing them off, and the attack on the printing press prevented the gatherings from ever being printed in the first place. So if you ever look, and if you're just joining us in the early episodes of Filling in the History, talked about it. In fact, hang on. This is a very small book, 1833, Book of Commandments. And literally at the end, it cuts off in the middle of a revelation because that's when they attacked it. So the appendix never made it. But that's my little replica copy. This is actually printed by the Reorganized Church, and I'm very grateful for it. It's kind of a fun read, and it's fun to see where it is. But this is an enormously rare volume because of the destruction of the press. So if you find them today, they're usually like auctioned or given as enormously expensive gifts. Very precious books. All right, let's get into the contents and footnotes of this. It says in the Revelation, prepare ye, O my people, sanctify yourselves, gather ye together, O ye people of my church upon the land of Zion. All you that have not been commanded to tarry, go ye out from Babylon, be ye clean that bear the vessels of the Lord. Call your solemn assemblies, and speak often one to another, and let every man call upon the name of the Lord. Footnote 7 for this says, the phrase solemn assembly appears a number of times in the Old Testament, usually referring to a gathering of elders in a spirit of fasting and prayer. So you could technically call a fast and testimony meeting a solemn assembly, technically. Although I think it means sort of a more organized function. The appendix also states, but verily thus saith the Lord, let not your flight not be in haste, but let all things be prepared before you, and he that goeth, let him not look back, lest sudden destruction shall come upon him. Footnote 13 for this says, the elders of the church in conferences were supposed to supervise the work of the gathering as they obtained knowledge from the bishop or the agent of the church about the privileges of the lands. Okay, our appendix also says, and now verily thus saith the Lord, that these things might be made known among you, O inhabitants of the earth. I have sent forth mine angel flying through the midst of heaven, having the everlasting gospel, who hath appeared unto some, and hath committed unto man, who shall appear unto many that dwell on the earth. And this gospel shall be preached unto every nation and kindred and tongue and people, and the servants of God shall go forth, saying with a loud voice, fear God, and give glory to him, for the hour of his judgment is come, and worship him that made heaven and earth and the sea and the fountain of waters. So footnote 25 for this says, John the Revelator prophesied that in the last days an angel would fly in the midst of heaven, having the everlasting gospel to preach unto them that dwell on the earth. An article reprinted in the Painesville Telegraph, there you are again, in December 1830 recounted that church members believed that an angel of light had given Joseph Smith the new gospel identified as the gold plates from which the Book of Mormon was translated. So lots of Book of Revelations sort of connections there, we should say. The Revelation also gives us this. For this cause, these commandments were given. They were commanded to be kept from the world in that day, that they were given, but now are to go forth unto all flesh. A little confusing grammar there, but it says this. Footnote 39, 50 years after the conference approving the publications of the Revelations, David Whitmer claimed that he had opposed publication because he believed that it was not the will of the Lord that the Revelations should be published. So there was, and we talked about this in an earlier episode, that there was a lot of debate on, like, should people really know about this, or should we keep it private? And thus you have Section 133, or as we call it, the Appendix. So Section 1 is the preface, and Section 133, as we have it today anyway, is the Appendix. And it was supposed to be in our little Book of Commandments here, but it wound up being in the 1835 edition of the Doctrine and Covenants and every edition after that, which is kind of fun. All right, so now we're going to move on to Section 134. Again, we're going back in time here. The earliest copy that we get is actually printed in the 1835 Doctrine and Covenants edition. It shows up as Section 102, and it is called Of Governments and Laws in General. Manuscript History of the Church has a copy. It is scribed by Willard Richards. We also get a copy found in the 1844 Doctrine and Covenants, and in that case, it is Section 105, and it is called Of Governments and Laws in General. Still the title, same thing. The circumstances surrounding this for Section 134, we get the Doctrine and Covenants, the 1835 Doctrine and Covenants states this, that our belief with regard to earthly governments and laws in general may not be misinterpreted nor misunderstood. We have thought proper to present at the close of this volume our opinion concerning the same. The 1844 Doctrine and Covenants actually gives us the same thing. So the manuscript history describes the conference that ratified the revelation. So there's a whole thing about publishing and setting out a witness statement that we have today in the Doctrine and Covenants. And then we get this. It says, President O. Cowdery then read the following article on governments and laws in general, which was accepted and adopted and ordered to be printed in said book by a unanimous vote. So that's how we get it. Modern section headings, everything is actually the same, but there's one sentence that's different. So we get the whole introduction, when and where it was given, and then we remove the reference to History of the Church, Volume 2 in 2013. But this is what we get. In 1981, it says, the occasion was a meeting of church leaders brought together to consider the proposed content of the first edition of the Doctrine and Covenants. And the 2013 edition changes that. It says, many saints gathered together to consider the proposed contents of the first edition of the Doctrine and Covenants. At that time, this declaration was given the following preamble, and then everything else is the same. Okay, so the historical introduction for this little portion here, it says, on the 17th of August, 1835, Oliver Cowdery and Sidney Rigdon presented the Doctrine and Covenants to a General Assembly of the Church in Kirtland, Ohio for approval. Joseph Smith, who was visiting Michigan Territory with Frederick G. Williams, was not present at this assembly. How about that? After representatives of different priesthood offices expressed their satisfaction with the book, and after the whole congregation unanimously accepted and acknowledged it as the Doctrine and Covenants of their faith. So, I love it when the Doctrine and Covenants was ratified as a document, Joseph Smith was not even present. And so we're going to get into, why is this document even in the Joseph Smith papers then? So bear with me. Further into this introduction we get, the Declaration on Government and Law outlined the church's beliefs regarding the proper role of government in society. The most apparent motive for the declaration was the expulsion of church members from Jackson County, Missouri in 1833. The declaration may have also served to quell general complaints about the church's recent political discourse. The Painesville Telegraph, for example, criticized the church's newspaper, complaining that the church was seeking political influence. However, by publicly declaring the church's belief in constitutionally protected freedoms, the saints may have intended the declaration to recast their political discourse as a fundamentally American form of free speech. An interesting approach. And finally, the authorship of the declaration is unclear, as is the extent to which Joseph Smith was involved in preparing it. Cowdery, who read the declaration at the assembly, may have been the primary author. So, kind of hard to know, but yeah, Joseph wasn't there for the ratification of the Doctrine and Covenants, and there's a good chance Oliver Cowdery wrote this, and Joseph may not have had anything to do with it, but because he references it later and other things that go along with that, that is why it is included in the Joseph Smith papers. So there you go. All right, so let's get into the content and footnotes of this bad boy. The statement gives us this. We believe that all governments necessarily require civil officers and magistrates to enforce the laws of the same, and that such as will administer the law in equity and justice should be sought for and upheld by the voice of the people, if a republic, or the will of the sovereign. Footnote 1 for this says, church leaders presented the failure of the government to enforce these laws as a crisis of dire proportions. In a petition sent to Governor Dunklin, they wrote, believing with all honorable men that whenever that fatal hour shall arrive, that the poorest citizen's person, property, or rights and privileges shall be trampled upon by a lawless mob with impunity, that moment a dagger is plunged into the heart of the Constitution, and the Union must tremble. So further into this statement we believe that all men are bound to sustain and uphold the respective governments in which they reside, while protected in their inherent and respective government. Okay. We believe that all men are bound to sustain and uphold the respective governments in which they reside, while protected in their inherent and unalienable rights by the laws of such governments, and that sedition and rebellion are unbecoming every citizen thus protected and should be punished accordingly, and that all governments have a right to enact such laws as in their own judgments are best calculated to secure the public interest, at the same time, however, upholding sacred the freedom of conscience. And some people call that freedom of religion. Anyway, footnote 2. A petition church leaders sent to Governor Dunklin expressed the relationship between government's duties to ensure citizens' rights and citizens' duties to uphold the law. The petition explained that the saints had patiently endured and upheld law while waiting for the government of Missouri to fulfill its duty of protection, and stated, quote, we solicit assistance to obtain our rights, holding ourselves amenable to the laws of our country whenever we transgress them, unquote. Verse 7 says, from this, if you take it by verses, we believe that rulers, states, and governments have a right and are bound to enact laws for the protection of all citizens and the free exercise of their religious belief. But we do not believe that they have a right in justice to deprive citizens of this privilege or prescribe them in their opinions, as long as a regard and reverence is shown to the laws, and such religious opinions do not justify sedition nor conspiracy. Footnote 3 for this says, Cowdery made specific complaint in his December 1833 article that, in open violation of the Constitution, Missouri residents were allowed to persecute, even unto death, a fellow being for his religion. And that is all that we get from section 134. So a statement, this is not considered a revelation. This is sort of a public statement about the church's response and how they deal with earthly governments and what that has to do with them. So, okay, we're going to move on into the actual history of this section here. So we've gone through these sections that went before. We are still in documents 12 of the Joseph Smith papers, and in English, that means we're going between March and July of 1843. So we're coming up to the point where Joseph Smith has about 1 year left of life. And so this part, we're going to talk about a gift for Emma. We're going to talk about a very interesting thing that happens with the Potawatomi tribe, which was a contemporary tribe to this area, and a lot of battling extradition that happened. The first thing we get after Section 132, which Emma was enormously opposed to, was a deed to 68 lots of land in Nauvoo valued at $10,000. Historical introduction gives us this. Joseph Smith may have deeded this property to Emma to assure her that she and her children would have financial security even within a system of plural marriage. And this constituted about 10% of the plot of the Nauvoo city itself. So this was a very wealthy gift given. But this was kind of to her and others. And I think personally, too, it was part of like, if something was to happen to me or, whatever, if I got sued, they couldn't come after this stuff because it was in the name of my wife. I know there's a lot of people, even in our day, that do that sort of thing. All right, we also get a document that will take us back to one of the earliest parts of filling in the history. This is a request for the church to add their story and history to a book called He Pas Ecclesia, which winds up giving us another telling of the first vision story, if you remember that. This is kind of like it was trying to gain an understanding of like all of the American religions. This is going back a ways, but this is where that comes from. This is how far into the history we are. After this, we get the first public discourse about eternal marriage, which is given in the Grove of Nauvoo. It does not seem to be about plural marriage, but states that eternal marriage in the temple is a function of salvation. And this is something that unless I'm mistaken, is basically talked about at almost every general conference of the church now. Okay, so we're going to skip a bunch of stuff again. This time we're speaking mostly to things like upcoming elections, people reporting on their experiences in the mission field. There is an attorney asking that his fees be paid. Some things never change. And then we get the death of Elias Higbee, who was a very prominent member of the church. He is now buried in the Nauvoo Cemetery. This consisted mostly of speaking to the power of the sealings and that they would receive the Nauvoo, that they would be receiving in the Nauvoo temple, and how it takes away the victories of death in a way. So, um, big discourse on, why, we don't have to fear death as much as we used to, because at one point we will be together again. I will pause here on a very interesting letter that we get from somebody by the name of Pai Kauchabe and other Potawatomi tribe leaders written to Joseph Smith. So this is in the handwriting of somebody by the name of Jonathan Dunham, who was their interpreter. And a lot of these agents were actually from the U.S. government. So they were agents from the U.S. to these tribes. And their main question in this letter was whether or not they needed to cede more land to the United States government or not. So the historical introduction to this document gives us this. It is also possible that, having heard rumors that Joseph Smith received revelation from God, the Potawatomi were seeking spiritual answers for their difficulties. During the April meeting, Pai Kauchabe said, according to the interpreter, that identified white men told him that Joseph Smith could talk to the Great Spirit, and he wanted him, who is Joseph Smith, to advise them on what to do. Now, at the beginning of this letter, you might notice that it says Father. They actually address Joseph Smith as Father. And why are they doing that? Well, we get this from the historical introduction. The letter's request that Joseph Smith become their new father almost certainly referred to a request for him to become their new federally appointed Indian agent. But a very interesting sort of like, we will follow you. Like, you're going to be our leader. You're going to be a father to us. Very interesting. So there was some time passing that there, some things kind of happened in between here. And then we get a written response from Joseph Smith after they spend some time together in Nauvoo. And there's images of them there's paintings where apparently Joseph Smith, because they were guests, whenever he would preach in the grove, he would have them sit on the stand with him in the middle of the grove. So they were sort of put in a place of honor, which is kind of fun. So even after all that, they spend some time together. We get a written letter. The language is very cautious, admonishing them to work with the United States government on lands, and that Joseph would love to be their agent, but he must be properly appointed by the federal government. He signs it, your father. He doesn't sign it as Joseph Smith, which is very interesting. The letter also included a map of land to show the proper boundaries of where everything was, and then he also gave them a copy of Facsimile 2 from the Book of Abraham. So this is the hypoglyph. This is the one that, or the hypocephaloglyph or something. Anyway, it's the circular one that went behind the head of the mummies that were there. Anyway, we do have some paintings at this meeting, as well as something that is published in Documents Volume 3. So I'll show you this picture. This is showing Ansaki. This is the sulk in the act of praying. And this was in the documents of the Joseph Smith papers. So forgive me if this is not one of the Potawatomi people, but it could be a depiction of that or their best estimate of it, perhaps. But this is what we have, and I just wanted to show that to you as well, just kind of give you a sense of what members of the tribe could have looked like. So anyway, very interesting interaction between the two. And something that I love is one of the footnotes said that there were gifts to be exchanged between the two. And apparently the tribal leaders of the Potawatomi were like, no, you don't get to ask them for anything, because they were driven out of their lands by the United States government, just like we were. Now, I had never thought of it that way before. I had never thought of it that the Latter-day Saints and the Native Americans had that in common, that we kept being pushed out of lands that we were promised were ours and that we had the proper paperwork for and all that stuff. So a very interesting relationship between the two groups, that they would have that in common, to the point where apparently their leaders were like, no, we don't ask for things unless they're given freely, because they've gone through just as much as we have, and they may not have much to give. So I thought that was just a very interesting relationship between the two, as I said before. All right. Skipping right along, we get a letter to Thomas Ford on the 21st of August that Willard Richards wrote on Joseph's behalf, letting Governor Ford know that Missourians had made an incursion or might make an incursion in Illinois, as well as some papers once again tried to avoid an extradition in any arrest attempts against Joseph Smith. We get a discourse that discussed not just 2, but 3 orders of the priesthood. So we get this from the historical introduction. Joseph Smith taught that there were 3 orders of priesthood in a hierarchy of power: the Levitical or Aaronic, the Abrahamic or patriarchal, and the Melchizedek, which culminated in a fullness of the priesthood. This teaching expanded the Latter-day Saints' understanding of priesthood authority from the simpler dichotomy of Aaronic and Melchizedek priesthood he had taught previously. So there's that additional Abrahamic that's in there. And I believe, again, this is sort of going back to my personal opinion about Elias in the Kirtland Temple, that this has a lot more to do with like the sealing of families together, rather than just the administration of the gospel to each other. But this is the thing that seals the families together and the children to their fathers. So my opinion, amateur historian. Moving on. We also get this nugget at the end of 2 of the discourse notes. It says this: Joseph also said that the Holy Ghost is now in a state of probation, which if he should perform in righteousness, he may pass through the same on a similar course of things that the Son has. Interesting. So the Holy Ghost, being a person in spirit form, is kind of going through a little test of his own. And if he, if they fulfill a calling, then they move on to the next step. So kind of an interesting idea. Anyway, we get an interview published in the Gazette and Virginia Advertiser, which is kind of a crappy name for a paper if you ask me, that describes Joseph Smith as a dupe. He's low of wit, laughs too much at his own jokes, and also said that Nauvoo was very vain and unhappy and in a not very nice place. So whoever that guy was seemed to have a kind of a preconceived notion of Nauvoo and everything else. Moving on to September of 1843, we eventually get a letter from Francis Higbee stating that he was innocent of conspiring with Sidney Rigdon to deliver Joseph Smith and others to the Missouri mob. So this is, again, like John C. Bennett and Sidney Rigdon were conspiring to do that. They let Orson Hyde know. Orson Hyde sort of blew the cover on it, and Joseph doesn't want to be around him much anymore. Even though they kind of reconciled about it, they were still very much in caution, which is kind of strange because Sidney Rigdon is in the first presidency. So a little harsh there. Anyway, that, my friends, is the end of Documents Volume 2. So we're going to put that one aside. Or 12. What did I say? Volume 12, not Volume 2. Heaven's sakes. And now we're going to move on to Documents Volume 13. Now, this covers us from August through December of 1843. So, like I said, every part has a month because we've got, a lot of documents now to go through. So let's start. On our new Documents Volume 13 book that we have, we get a letter back from Thomas Ford on September 13. He's kind of calling the bluff that the Missourians are trying to invade, and he keeps his course on getting Joseph to give himself over to the authorities. Like, you got to do this. After Joseph Smith once again tried to show how nasty the Missouri Wobs are, and these are the reasons why he will or will not submit, none of these things work, and Ford continues to press the issue. Like, you've got to turn yourself in. I'm sorry. I don't care if they're doing... He basically says, I just don't care. Do it. We get many letters and discourses. Francis Bishop tries to be readmitted into the church after claiming that he had some angelic revelations and that he was being ordained by angels and being visited by the Ancient of Days. All of that kind of stuff eventually led to him getting excommunicated, and we never get a response from Joseph Smith on that matter, so I can't tell you how that landed. But the Joseph Smith papers couldn't come up with a response. There are a lot of various reports, especially from the British mission and the changing of the presidency over in that mission and their success and progress and moving saints to America. This eventually will get us to the October General Conference of the Church in 1843. Now, this one was a big one because the church would hear about Sidney Rigdon and then hear about the building of the temple and its progress. So even though Joseph disagreed, the conference actually decides to hold Sidney in his office as a member of the first presidency. So this is really interesting. So Joseph didn't just override things. He was like, I don't think this is right. But apparently the conference was like, let him stay in the first presidency. So he stayed. There was some discourse on the nature of spirits, which we keep getting over and over again. The building of the temple, the resources that they needed. And then the conference closed after 2 days. And we have 3 manuscript notes of that meeting. So that's what they talked about. Now, the finishing of the temple is a major item during this time, sort of this time frame. So we get authorizations for various people to raise funds. We got some chatter back and forth on inquiries about the saints and hoping to learn more, which is kind of fun. So people would learn about the church or get a copy of the Book of Mormon, read a pamphlet, and they would write letters to Joseph Smith saying, hey, this is what I think, or you think, and that, can we jive, kind of meet you, all that kind of stuff. It's kind of fun. Not a lot of responses to that. And I'd like to think that there was a response to that, but whoever had it, it's lost, it got wet, it burned in a fire, who knows? Anyway, but we don't have any correspondence back from Joseph Smith for a lot of those. We get discourses on the economy of Nauvoo and taking care of the people in the city, especially if they are poor. And I'd like to say in the Joseph Smith papers, when it says discourse, it doesn't just mean religious topics. It's talking about, laws in the city and all sorts of stuff like that. So that is part of the deal. We get a letter to Governor Ford on October 16th asking for munitions for the armory so that the Nauvoo Legion could be supplied properly. This was sent by the hand of W. Phelps. And there's no proof that they ever got what they asked for on this one, which is kind of interesting that even though he's like, you got to turn yourself over, but at the same time, you're the lieutenant general of the Nauvoo Legion and a mayor, so you can't ask me for stuff. So, what a weird relationship that must have been. But anyway, that's, that they went back and forth, but apparently they never got to go shopping in the armory. We get a letter on October 24th from John Arlington Bennett, not related to John C. Bennett, who's being a little bit of a jerk right now, who was from upstate New York and was a relatively recent convert. Now, John C. had introduced the two together, but now that he was sort of out of the picture, Joseph and John Arlington got to speak together directly. There's much to get through, but apparently John Arlington got a wax seal engraved of Joseph Smith, and he used it to mail the letter, which is kind of fun. So this is what it looks like. He basically said, this is a private seal, and this is the kind of, this is what I sealed your letter with, and you can see the residue from that, and a little piece of a broken version of that here. And in response to this, when Joseph saw that, he says this: as the private seal you mention, if sent to me, I shall receive it with gratitude of a servant of God and pray that the donor may receive a reward in the resurrection of the just. Okay, so apparently I don't have any money to give you, but, I'm sure you'll be great in the next life. So I thought that was kind of fun. There's a lot of letters with no known responses. There was a lot of mission reports. There's land deals. There's land sale offers and so forth. And then we get another letter, this time from Boston, to have John E. Page stick around much longer because he was such a great guy. This happened in Philadelphia, if you remember. He has some real charm. And yet again, another congregation doesn't want him to leave. And this will actually lead us to an unpublished revelation, which I'll get to in due time, which is kind of fun. But John E. Page, you're the man, and people love you. We get more letters, more land deals, but one letter, which is actually held at Clemson University, sent to John C. Calhoun on the 4th of November, 1843, is interesting because he is somebody who is running for president. And it seems that Willard Richards wrote a series of these letters to Henry Clay, John C. Calhoun, as we said, Lewis Cass, Richard M. Johnson, and Martin Van Buren, trying to find out what their policies will be about the Mormons if they were to be elected president of the United States. And obviously they wanted to know who would be kind of favorable to them. So I'm not really sure why Marty got a card. Martin Van Buren was kind of a dope, and Joseph didn't like him, but I guess he was still like, how are you going to treat the Latter-day Saints? Anyway, he's already kind of mentioned what that was. So I'm not really sure why he got one, but whatever. Anyway, one of my favorites from this section is so funny to me. This is a poem written by W. Phelps, and he's asking Joseph Smith for a land deed for his wife. So W. Phelps is like, can I get some land for my wife? And rather than do that, I will explain it to you through song, basically, in this poem. So I'm going to read this poem to you, so I think it's funny. The goodly city of Nauvoo, November 7th, and that will do. President Smith, how do you do? From me this line will speak with you, health, peace, and grace, and all things too, be unto thee till life is through. A blight over me has shadowed you, but still my soul to you is true. I ask no wealth of old or new, but come what will, I'll make it do. I cannot live as others do, and be a half a man with you. I am a man as men can view, and God will let me die, or do. You bless the 12 with things anew, so bless my wife with something too. 12 years she's waded through the sea of woe without ado, and still remains the same and true. Deed her a lot, and that will do. William Clayton knows the one in view. May God your path with honor strew, is William's poetry to you. Unquote. I should have thought of that when I bought my house. Maybe if I wrote a poem, things would have gone easier. I don't know. But there you go. Somebody wrote a poem and said, please give my wife some land in Nauvoo. And I wish I could tell you what the outcome of that was, but we're not going to read through all the lands transactions because that's really annoying. So I would like to say that it worked. I'd like to just kind of believe that. All right, we get a letter back from Henry Clay that states that he has followed the plight of the saints and that religion should have protections, but made it pretty clear that he will probably do nothing because that would imply favoritism. Not a very good play if you're running for president. So, Henry Clay, you've kind of blown it a little bit there. After this, we get Joseph preferring charges against somebody named Harrison Sagers in his own hands. So, Joseph's writing this. This goes to William Marks, and it says, Nauvoo City, November 21st, 1843. Brother Marks, dear sir, I hereby prefer the following charges against Elder Harrison Sagers, namely, first, for trying to seduce a young girl living at his house by the name of Phoebe Madison. Second, for using my name in a blasphemous manner by saying that I tolerated such things, and which thing her is guilty of lying, etc., etc. Joseph Smith. Again, I apologize for the grammar there, but you don't do that sort of thing. However, the next thing we get on the 25th of November, 1843, is an unpublished revelation. This is Willard Richards' handwriting, and it is a leaf of paper that's stored up at the Church History Library, and I will read it because we read unpublished revelations. And then forgive me, I'm just going to read it the way it is. Let my servant John E. Page take his departure speedily from the city of Boston and go directly to the city of Washington, and there labor diligently in proclaiming my gospel to the inhabitants thereof. And if he is humble and faithful, lo, I will be with him, and will give him the hearts of the people that he may do them good, and build up a church unto my name in that city. And this is likely a response to the letter asking Elder Page to stay in Boston because he's such a swell guy. So there is another unpublished revelation. Okay, after this, wouldn't you know it, we get some remarks. It's just called remarks in the Joseph Smith papers on should adultery be allowed in the church, since a few people were saying that Joseph Smith was all right with him doing it. And then after that, they're sent to church court and excommunicated. So here are the remarks, and they say this. President Joseph Smith made an address upon the subject which was highly interesting, and its tendency was to do away with every evil and practice virtue and holiness before the Lord, that the church had not received any license from him to commit adultery, fornication, or any such thing, but to the contrary, if any man commit adultery, he could not receive the celestial kingdom of God, even if he was saved in any kingdom. It could not be the celestial kingdom. He said he thought the many examples that had been manifest, John C. Bennett and others, was sufficient to show the fallacy of such a course of conduct. He condemned the principle in 2, and warned those present against going into those evils, for they would surely bring a curse upon their heads. Now that seems pretty clear to me. I guess we don't do that sort of thing in the church. After this, we get the minutes of a meeting on the 29th of October, 1843, to organize an effort to seek redress for more wrongs against the church to the United States government, and an appeal to a group called the Green Mountain Boys. Now, this was a Vermont militia that was a Vermont militia that was active from 1764, so this is pre-Revolutionary War, all the way through to 1814, which means I assume they would have fought in the war in 1812. The memory is still very fresh to this day, and there's a couple of organizations that still call themselves the Green Mountain Boys. And looking online at this, they go out and shoot machine guns and all sorts of stuff still, so a rowdy group of people. Anyway, so that's sent in December, and we see this appeal published in the Times and Seasons. This is a very, very long document, but it's an appeal to the Green Mountain Boys as sort of the spirit of like, hey, we fought a revolution for these rights, and we're getting treated like crap down here. Can you come and help us? So that was published out in the Times and Seasons and set in their general direction. The appeal was a hope that other states maybe would come to their aid and appeal to their patriotic roots. The message was received, and a lot of sarcasm and contempt came from it. So they get it from all over, not just from official government officers, but the other states were just like, yeah, they were just very contemptuous about it, really sarcastic about their plight. I guess that's the way you handle it, I guess. Moving on, we get a response from presidential candidate John C. Calhoun, who had a very modern hairstyle, I might add. Look at that guy. Looking good. Anyway, he remembers talking to Joseph about this while he was in Washington, and that the federal government doesn't have jurisdiction over this sort of thing. So that's strike 2. The letter states thusly, Sir, you ask me what would be my rule of action relative to the Mormons or Latter-day Saints, should I be elected president, to which I answer that if I should be elected, I would strive to administer the government according to the Constitution and the laws of the Union, and that as they make no distinction between citizens of different religious creeds, I would make none. As far as it depends on the executive department, all should have the full benefit of both, and none should be exempt from their operation. But as you refer to the case of Missouri, candor compels me to repeat what I said to you at Washington, that according to my views, the case does not come within the jurisdiction of the federal government, which is one of limited and specific powers. With respect, I am, etc., J.C. Calhoun. I think I'm gonna write my letters like that from now on. With respect, etc., Amateur historian. Anyway, now we get into something that really occupies the minds and the actions of the Latter-day Saints for a while, and it is the kidnapping of 2 people, Philander and Daniel Avery. So we start this little journey with an affidavit stating that these 2 people were abducted. They were accused of stealing horses from Clark County, Missouri, so a mob kidnaps them in an illegal attempt to take care of this illegal claim. We get this letter, which is part of a packet to the Governor Ford, I should say, of Illinois. Joseph then gives a mayor's order to Henry Sherwood to get the Nauvoo Legion ready for action if other kidnappings occurred, or if an attack happened. And then we get an official requisition following on paper for this action. Then a military order is written to Wilson Law to keep the peace. Then we get an emergency session of the Nauvoo officers, with Joseph Smith presiding, to publish their intent to fight against any forcible taking of people, especially Joseph Smith, out of Nauvoo. They also resolved to build a dam on the Mississippi River for riverboats. Seems like kind of an odd time to bring that up. But anyway, that's what they did. Anyway, they published this new ordinance to the city and let people know that it is a full crime to be coming after people in Nauvoo, and laid out the punishments affixed to that. Wilson Law writes an acknowledgement of his orders to stand ready, and we get a pay order from the city treasury to pay for this protection from the Legion. So this is the salaries of the soldiers. And all this happens over a 2-day period, December 8th and 9th. We do also get a discourse about the Avery kidnappings that was made public when they were what they were doing, and that they would appeal to the governor yet again. So as you can see, like, there's a part of me that wonders if they were waiting for something like this so that they could, like, rally around and say, all right, this is why Joseph Smith can't be extradited or something. That's my opinion. But they definitely did all the things legally in every way, and there's documents flying everywhere, and yeah, all that stuff. So this little documentary event ends with a letter from Lewis Cass, who was another guy running for president. And he looks very either pleased with himself or just angry all the time in this picture, but I'll let you decide that. Anyway, he responds back to their letters of intent for the Mormon people, and his posture was that he really didn't know what was going on with the Mormon conflicts, and that he may or may not do something about it once he's president. So that's pretty lame. But that picture is also pretty lame. So we have that. We get this letter from Joseph Smith to his uncle John Smith, who was the president of the Macedonia stake in Illinois. And it says this. I really love this. President John Smith, your petition of a special conference of last November has been received, duly considered, and is granted. You have my best wishes in your behalf, as well as my prayers, that you may fill so honorable and exalted a station with the dignity, sobriety, and grace which has hitherto characterized your conduct and communion with men. As a man of God, respectfully yours, Joseph Smith. This is the same John Smith that actually becomes the patriarch to the entire church after Hiram Smith is murdered. So John Smith is Joseph Smith Sr.'s brother, basically. It's his uncle. So it's kind of fun. And apparently after he came to Nauvoo and sort of received all of this, Joseph also kind of went halfway back with him on his way back. And I'm sure it was just kind of a family thing. It's kind of fun. All right. Thomas Ford fires back with a letter to Joseph telling him to rely on the goodness of the judicial system and notwithstanding all the kidnapping charges that, it's going to be okay. It's going to be all right. The judges and the juries, it's all going to be okay. And of course, we know that a little after that, like once he does hand himself over to Missouri, they shoot him as soon as they possibly can. So yeah, Thomas Ford, you are gravely mistaken or just stupid enough to believe in that crap. But anyway, we skip a few city ordinances and such, and then we get a memorial to the United States Senate and the House of Representatives on very nice paper and handwriting. This is signed by the apostles, the presidency, Joseph Smith, of course, and postmarked to Washington, D.C. This is from this document that you're looking at is actually from the National Archives. So this is held by the United States government. John Frierson helps to write yet another petition, which is signed by the largest number of saints to date. And all of it was on this very fancy handwriting and paper. It's basically 18 pages long, so we're not going to read that one. But yeah, that is sent off to Congress, which is cool. Now we're back to the Avery kidnapping. We get a complaint against Robert D. Foster for having a hand in the kidnapping and disturbing the peace. Aaron Johnson petitions to have a detachment of 100 men, which is granted on the same piece of paper as a military order. And then we get a very touching letter from Martha Campbell speaking about Josiah Stoll. You remember that guy? He was one of the very early supporters of Joseph Smith. He offered his home as a shelter and a hiding place for the gold plates, and his health was starting to decline here in 1843. And he felt some guilt about not joining the saints in Ohio and Missouri and Illinois, and he kind of wanted to know his standing before Joseph Smith. He was a baptized member of the church, and he did actually pass away about 5 months later, just a number of weeks actually before Joseph Smith was murdered. So a little reminder of people like Josiah Stoll, who is one of the reasons why the church ever survived in the first place, quite frankly, and Joseph Smith himself. It's kind of interesting. We get a little bit more bait thrown out to Joseph Smith in a letter from Glenn Hardiman. This is on the 19th of December, 1843, and the historical introduction makes this very entertaining. It says, on the 19th of December, 1843, Glenn Hardiman composed a short letter from St. Louis to Joseph Smith in Nauvoo, Illinois, asking him to translate mysterious characters he claimed were copied from a piece of lidded cloth in a stone box recently dug out of a well near St. Louis. Hardiman was likely Glenn Owen Hardiman, an 18-year-old student at St. Louis's Kemper College. We don't have a response to this letter, but the characters are kind of convincing for a college prank anyway. But yeah, just another guy trying to bait Joseph and proving that he was a false prophet, I guess. Anyway, so back to the Avery kidnapping yet again. It looks like Daniel Avery was released a day after he had a hearing in Missouri. Then he met up with Joseph Smith and swore an affidavit, this affidavit here, to what happened to him when a mob from Missouri took him away. This happened around the same time that Porter Rockwell also gets released from the hands of Missourians. Again, he was on suspicion of trying to kill Governor Boggs. And this affidavit was intended to offer proof to the governor of the dangers they faced from Missouri mobs. And, basically, like, they cannot be trusted. You've got to not honor these extradition orders, all this kind of stuff. All right, so because of all of this, a meeting is called and a discourse is made to have 40 police officers make sure the city is safe and to offer immediate protection against invaders and the like. And that, my friends, is volume 13. That's everything you get. Lots of land deals and other things that I've skipped, of course. But that is the end of volume 13 and also the end of 1843. Which means, now that we're in 1844, there are only 2 more volumes left because Joseph Smith only survives through to the summertime. And then he loses his life in a hailstorm of bullets at Carthage jail. Our next episode will technically be the end, if I have my way, of the Joseph Smith Papers project. And then I'm debating on doing another episode after that just to sort of maybe wrap some things up or bring some things to the surface that might have been missed along the way. But thank you for sticking with me. This has been quite an adventure. And I will be preparing and studying the final portion of this long list of books here for you because I love you so much. And so I hope you have a great week, and we'll see you next time on Filling in the History.